Is it going to be easy? No. But will it give us a fairer solution? Yes. Will it give us solutions that take into full cognizance the realities of Global South countries? Yes. And that's the big push behind why we need to have a UN tax convention where conversations are had at the UN and subsequently, actions can then be taken.
Hello, my name is Katharina. Welcome to our first episode of a small podcast series dealing with the Agenda 2030. There is not much time left to reach the SDGs, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The achievement of the goals is directly linked to the development of the poorer countries in our world. However, these goals are more than far away, and the countries of the Global South, they need a lot of money for sustainable development. For example, for basic social and health services and education. Money which is lacking in particular due to an unfair global tax system. So, I am very happy to now have Chenai Mukumba with me to discuss the introduction of a UN tax convention, which could bring a juster global distribution of tax revenues. Chenai is the executive director of the Tax Justice Network Africa, which is headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome, Chenai. Good to see you.
Thanks so much, Katharina. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. So, Chenai, let's jump right in and talk about power. Let's talk about economic power. So, the countries in the Global South, measured by their economic power, they earn significantly less money from taxes than countries in the Global North. Am I correct with this? Can you confirm this?
Absolutely, I can confirm that. So statistics reflect that particularly, I'm from Africa, so I know those off the top of my fingers. African countries earn on average 18%, have 18% tax to GDP ratio, right? Whereas, for example, OECD countries, it's almost double that, right? They have a tax to GDP ratio of over 30%. And so absolutely, in terms of the amount of revenue that we are generating domestically from taxes, it is significantly less than larger developed countries.
Okay, yeah. So that's quite a disproportion indeed. So last year in 2022, there was a UN resolution that was considered historic. What was that about and what was so historic about it? Can you give us some insight?
I can, absolutely. So last year, adopted by consensus, was a resolution that had been tabled by Nigeria on behalf of the Africa Group. This resolution was to see how within the UN, there can be a process to promote both inclusiveness as well as the effectiveness of tax cooperation. The reason this was historic was because developing countries, various Global South groupings have been calling for this for the past 2 decades. And last year, after all of this concerted effort, we saw it adopted by consensus. And then we saw specifically the United States try to water it down, but countries were still in support of what, as I mentioned, Nigeria had tabled. And so historic in the sense that finally something that Global South countries had been asking for was finally achieved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for introducing us to this process and the way to this process. So why is it so important that this process is on UN level, that we discuss it on UN level? Why is that so important? And maybe we can also talk about, the obstacles and barriers within the process on UN level.
Yeah. So it's so important because right now the discussion about sort of global tax issues and the reform of the global tax system is largely being facilitated by the OECD Inclusive Framework. Now, the reason Global South countries, specifically in this context, African countries, have been pushing for those conversations to happen at the UN is because a significant number of developing countries, Global South countries, don't participate within the inclusive framework for a number of different reasons, right? Some of them is for financial reasons. Some of them is, for example, technical capacity reasons, etc. And so the shifting of this conversation to the OECD, where you have all member states participating in various conversations essentially already addresses the inclusivity question, right? Ideally, you want to have a say with regards to a conversation that's so important as far as it relates to your ability to generate taxes domestically.
Mm-hmm. I see. Maybe we can talk a bit more about the OECD and this problem with the OECD. And you already said that, it's important to, now shift to more inclusion. And maybe we can talk a bit more about the OECD, the problem with the OECD, and the interests of the OECD.
So I think with the OECD, as I mentioned, number one, it's the inclusivity question, right? So to give some numbers to this, there's 54 African countries. 27 of them are not members of the inclusive framework. So already 50% of African countries are not part and parcel of conversations that have very direct impacts with regards to their revenue generation, right? So I think that's the primary point. The second point is that, when you're having these conversations, ideally you want to have a neutral secretariat, a secretariat that is responsive and accountable to all members. At present, the OECD, the secretariat of the inclusive framework is the OECD. And so there's a conversation as well around accountability. That's another point. Another issue as well is that when you take a look at, if you've been following the most recent discussions with regards to the reform of the global tax system pertaining to the digital economy, if you pay close attention, you'll see that the outcomes of those conversations don't benefit global South countries, developing countries as much as, for example, richer countries. And some of the different demands, requests, right, that global South countries had put forward during these conversations weren't heeded to. So there's a discussion also to be had around, we need a platform where the concerns, the priorities, the needs of global South countries can be guaranteed to be taken into consideration whenever there's a discussion about global tax rules.
Yeah. Speaking of the interests and of the needs, I would like to talk about the figures, about money in particular at this point. How much money are we talking about that, escapes or disappears from African states? Can you give us figures of this illicit financial flows?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a tricky one, right? Because of the nature of illicit financial flows, it's hard to have figures. But there's been various efforts to try and put some numbers to it, because I think the minute you have numbers, that's the minute you can start to see just how large a problem it is. So in 2015, the initial estimates with regards to how much African countries were losing in terms of illicit financial flows, and this was reported in a publication of a panel that was chaired by His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, the numbers stood at $50 billion annually. And this was on the back of the fact that over the past 30 years, the African continent had lost over $1 trillion. The most recent figures show that we've actually seen an increase in illicit financial flows from the African continent, and the numbers now sit at a staggering $90 billion annually, so an almost doubling of this. In the report that actually gives us this $89 billion figure, this report that was published by UNCTAD, it actually starts to juxtapose what that $90 billion means for Africa. So in terms of as a percentage of GDP, this is close to 4% of our GDP, right, that African countries don't have access to, that we're losing. Also, if you consider how much the African continent receives, for example, in overseas development assistance or even private financing, it's almost double both of those figures. And so in a sense, the amount of money that Africa is losing is significant. That's the sort of GDP ratio I was talking to. But also, secondly, if maintained, could actually, to some degree, be more than the continent is receiving to help it achieve its developmental objectives.
Right. Okay, so we're really talking about huge sums, really huge sums, and these sums of taxpayer money that are lost in African countries every year. There seems to be, a lack of logistical support for business transactions and a lack of control options. But are these really only local problems, or how can we talk about it, and how can we refer to it as a sort of, well, informal economy to blame, or is that too short of a thought? What do you think?
I think it's a combination of both, right? So as an institution, we do work at both levels, at the national level and at the international level. It's important that we take a multi-pronged approach to addressing these issues. So, for example, at the national level, there's capacity issues, right? So, for example, not all of our revenue administrations have all of the resources that they need to do the important work that they do, whether this is human resources or financial. There's some legislation, for example, at national level that, if improved, can also help us, right, address some of these loopholes that particularly multinational corporations are able to take advantage of. But what's particularly important to note is that unless we deal with the issues at the international level, you can fix all of the problems that you have at national level. But essentially what that's akin to doing, right, is putting water, for example, in a bucket that has holes, right? So essentially we need international tax reform to also help address the loss of these resources that's going out of an African country into another country. Because at the end of the day, right, the resources that are leaving Africa have a destination, right? Where are they going? And so we need to address that problem as well, which is why, as I mentioned, we require a multi-pronged approach to dealing with this situation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's talk about the global level, and maybe you can give us some info on the basic idea of a global minimum tax, and where we stand on the way to it, to the global minimum tax. Maybe you can give us some information on that.
Yeah. So I think the conversation about a global minimum tax is one that is actually a concept that developing countries had been advocating for some time. And so essentially how that works is that it but essentially requires all countries to have a minimum rate at which all multinational corporations that are operating within their companies can be taxed. I said all, that's not correct. If you take a look at the regulations, it's really only going to affect sort of 100 of the largest multinational corporations. So let me just make that correction. But essentially what it does is it says you need to be taxed at a minimum of 15%. If a country, for example, decides not to do that for whatever reason and say is taxing multinational corporations, say at 2% in their respective countries, the multinational corporation doesn't get away with it, because then essentially there is another rule that kicks in that says then, well, the country where you are headquartered then needs to make up that deficit, right? So that ultimately you still taxed at 15%. Global South countries, however, ATAF, which is the Africa Tax Administration Forum, when they were in negotiations at the Inclusive Framework about this, said that 15% is not high enough. And the reason is because in many African countries, our corporate income tax rates range between 25 and 30%. So essentially, to have a minimum tax rate of 15% doesn't really address the problem, right? For example, certain companies sort of shifting profits around. So I hope that makes sense in terms of what the global minimum tax looks like.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Let's have a look, or let's take a look into the future of the International Tax Convention. What could it look like in practice? Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah. So essentially what the convention looks like, essentially an agreement that creates a platform where all countries, right, are able to collectively think through the decisions that need to be taken to correct the global tax system. And when I say correct the global tax system, to give a bit of context, our current global tax system was established about 100 years ago, before many global South countries, and specifically African countries, were even in existence, right? And so as they became independent countries, they found themselves having to adhere to rules and regulations that they themselves had no say in, right? And of course, as you can imagine, the countries that were in existence at the time had framed those rules to benefit themselves, right? So in a sense, there's those issues that need to be tackled, right? And so essentially what we're hoping will happen at the UN is conversations about how can we correct this and how can we do it with everybody at the table, looking at issues that were at play when, these things were first developed. Is it going to be easy? No. But will it give us a fairer solution? Yes. Will it give us solutions that take into full cognizance the realities of Global South countries? Yes. And that's the big push behind why we need to have a UN tax convention where conversations are had at the UN and subsequently, actions can then be taken.
Right. So you were already talking about the strong role of African countries, of Nigeria in leading the way on the UN tax convention. What do you think? Will they keep this position in this process? What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, just based off of, most recent actions by Nigeria, we've seen them table, of course, this second, as we're speaking, right? There's a current discussion happening now in terms of, okay, so the first one was we need to have a conversation about a UN tax convention. And in that first resolution, the Secretary General was asked to develop a report to help countries think through what that conversation could look like. The Secretary General developed this report. This current resolution was now looking at what the Secretary General had proposed. There was 3 options and saying, this is the direction we need to be going. The second resolution, again, tabled by Nigeria on behalf of the Africa Group. And so we still see Nigeria taking that lead role. And then, of course, just last week, the Nigerian mission in New York put out a press release really calling on member states to support this initiative by the Africa Group, and noting it as a really urgent conversation that needs to be had.
Right. So what a position for negotiation of civil society could look like in Germany, for example. What do you think?
So I think what we would really, and I say we as sort of African civil society organizations, I think what we would really ask of our allies in Germany is for them to engage with their governments, because a lot of the pushback that the Africa Group is receiving is coming from the EU, is coming from OECD countries. And the reason is because, I've obviously spoken from a developing country perspective, but this issue affects everybody. Illicit financial flows affect everybody. I talk about sort of the magnitude in terms of as a percentage of GDP that African countries are having to suffer loss of. But in terms of amounts of money, right, the largest amounts of money are actually being drawn from EU countries themselves. So they themselves have a benefit to be had, right, where we have conversations take place at the UN. But also, I think for me, as a society, we ascribe to certain values, certain norms, democracy being one of them, right? And if it's something that we are sort of constantly ascribing needs to be had at national level, surely it should be something that also we think is valuable even at the international level. Democracy isn't easy at the national level, but we see it as important that people's voices are heard in terms of contributing to decision making. That should be the same thing at the international level.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chenai, for the great interview and of course the helpful info and the helpful insights into a UN tax convention. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Katharina.